Wilbur. Thank you for coming out in this chilly weather this morning. It's a little cool out there. So anyway, I'm glad you're here. And here we are on the Sunday before Thanksgiving. And like many of you, we're going to be traveling to spend the holiday with my nieces and nephews, which is the only extended family that I have left on my side, at least. And this is something we've done every year since my parents died. And it's something we usually look forward to. However, last year, there was a little conflict between a couple of the folks there, and things got a little tense, and so that sort of dampened our enthusiasm for this coming episode, see how that's like. Now, of course, I'm sort of sorry that I have to share that, because of course you think my family's perfect. No, you know me, you know better than that. But I think maybe we want folks to think that the family's perfect, but my hunch is that all of us have somebody in our family who's a problem. And we find it difficult to deal with them. And so what do? How do we handle those kinds of situations? Well, that's what we're going to think about this morning. Now, maybe reading the Bible passage will help us a little bit. I'm not going to read the whole thing, actually, because it's a little lengthy. But this is it from Mark's Gospel, which was, remember, the first Gospel written after the death of Jesus, some 30 or 40 years after he died. And the writer of Mark is telling about the time that Jesus went back to his hometown of Nazareth and the kind of reactions he got when he went there. Now, they encountered these people who claimed that they were amazed at him. How did he get to be this wise? And then the next person would say something like this: he's just a carpenter, Mary's boy. We've known him since he was a kid. We know his brothers, James, Justus, Jude, Simon, and his sisters. Who does he think he is? Well, it's kind of interesting what happens when we go back to our hometown, isn't it? Or go back home in any way, shape, or form. Because, Jesus had obviously changed since he had left town and was a different kind of person than he had been. And yet, nobody seemed to recognize that. They just simply thought about what they had known about him from his family and what he was like when he was a child there. So no one really recognized and honored who he was now and the person he had now become. Well, I don't know if you've had that happen, but I have sort of a mini episode of that happened a month or so ago when I went back for a high school reunion. I graduated from Madison High School in the southern part of the state a lot of years ago now. And I really, once I graduated and I went off to college, got married, was a teacher, then a pastor, and really hadn't stayed up a lot with a lot of the folks there. So they had no idea what my life path had been. And frankly, if the truth be known, they probably could have cared less what it was going to be like. Nonetheless, I was a little apprehensive about this. I was a little nervous about this reunion and even in deciding whether or not to go, and finally I decided to go, and then I fretted about, okay, what's it going to be like? What am I going to think? What are they going to think? Well, I recognize even some of the people I knew. Well, they recognize me. What on earth are we going to have to talk about? Well, finally the whole thing was done, and I have to admit that I was quite relieved, even though it turned out a little better than I feared it might. Well, maybe we have that sort of sense, too, when it comes to dealing with our families, because, the media would have us believe that every family is absolutely ideal, that there's nothing but smiles and hugs and lots of love oozing out everywhere, and yet I'm sure that happens in some cases, but my hunch is that's probably more the exception than it is the rule, because most of us have those situations that are kind of difficult. We have a person or an experience that creates some stress for us and some tension accordingly. It certainly happens at our homes. Now, I said that first service when my husband was here and realized there's only 2 people in our home. And so one of us is difficult, obviously. I don't think it's me, of course. Of course, right. So it happens in our homes, it happens at school, and it happens in the workplace. It can be a boss, it can be a coworker, it can be a critical parent or a friend who kind of drags us down. It can be a stubborn child, and who knows, sometimes it can even be me. It can even be you. And so, how do we deal with that? Do you know the surprising thing is it even happens in church? None of you, of course, but it happens in church. Some of you are familiar with the name of Will Rogers. He was a humorist from several decades ago. And Will Rogers was known for saying, I never met a man I didn't like. I never met a man I didn't like. Well, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there is a church by the name of Will Rogers United Methodist Church. One of the pastors of this church suggested that the slogan should become, "We are the folks Will Rogers never met." Think about it. It'll sink in a minute. So it's just a little difficult sometimes to deal with people in every setting, wherever we happen to be. Well, Jesus encountered a situation similar to that when he went back to his hometown. So maybe we can figure out a way for us to deal with it by looking at the way he handled the situation. What did he do? Now, this is what he said to his friends. A prophet has little honor in his hometown, among his relatives, on the streets he played in as a child. Jesus wasn't able to do much of anything there. He laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. That's all. He couldn't get over their stubbornness. He left and made a circuit of the other villages, teaching. Well, maybe there are a couple clues embedded in here that we can think about. Now, one of the things that I kind of assume that's never written there, but in reading between the lines, was that Jesus was probably a little dejected and a little hurt by what he experienced by the folks that he had known as a child. And yet he decided to take the high road and to try to be kind, to do what he could, those who would receive him, those who would welcome him, to do what he could there, and then to go on, to move on somewhere else. He didn't try to change the folks, to try to convince them to think otherwise or be different from the way they were. Well, there's something we can pick up from that, because I think there are times that you and I bang our heads against a wall thinking that we're going to change this person, or we're going to convince them that this is different than they think. And that just doesn't work. We can't change anybody else. The only person we can change is ourselves. So we just need to be kind and patient and loving and take the high road and, if necessary, move on. And then there's something else we can think about when we encounter those difficult situations or those difficult people, and that's to think about how we're handling that situation. Because the way we handle the situations with difficult people tells us a lot about us. In fact, it probably tells us more about us than it does about the other person. Sherry Carter Scott wrote a book a number of years ago called If Life is a Game, These Are the Rules. And in it, she wrote these words: you cannot love or hate something about another person unless it reflects something you love or hate about yourself. In other words, what she's saying is that if we find a person to be difficult, we maybe want to think about what that difficulty is, because it may be a barometer about ourselves. It may be a barometer that tells us how we perceive ourselves. Well, I think that caused me pause as I reflected on her words, thinking that that is something we can learn and gain from those situations that we encounter, and we all have them, that are challenging for us, that are difficult for us, because what can we learn about ourselves, and what might be a better way for us to handle those situations, and how, therefore, would that improve our relationships with one another if we thought about that? Maybe what we need to do is have a shift in the way we see things, a shift in thinking, if you will. Now, let's think about that for a minute. Suppose we have this really opinionated uncle. What if we chose to think that somehow was going to be good for us and helpful for us, and we could see him as a gift? What if we have a niece who talks nonstop and drives us crazy? Is there another way for us to think about that rather than just kind of seeing her as a pain for us? And what about that critical parent? Is there a way that we could think of that as a positive rather than always considering it a negative for us? It does have to do with what we bring to the situation and how we handle the situation. So how can we maybe improve it? But the reality is we do encounter situations that are incredibly difficult, often in our families, sometimes in our workplace, especially if we have a long history with someone. And there may be some repetition of behavior that really is wearing on us, and maybe erratic behavior that keeps popping up in unexpected times. And I read an article in Psychology Today that was insightful for me, because one of the things it suggested is that if we encounter this erratic behavior from the same person over a long period of time, that we probably need to be wary of really investing ourselves 100% in that relationship. Probably because that kind of behavior may indicate some deception going on. And if there is deception going on, that means there can't be trust. And if there can't be trust, that means there can't be a really well-grounded relationship at all. And so then maybe we need to think about our action being a little bit like that of Jesus. Maybe he realized that was the situation where he was. And so he took the high road. He was always loving. He did what he could. And then he moved on. He learned from his experience, and then he went on to that where he would be received. Well, maybe we need to think the same way. I don't know that it's worth anything or not, but we probably are going to encounter situations like that in the weeks ahead as we move through the holidays. So maybe that'll be a little help for us.